You've probably walked past a building today that's older than your grandparents, maybe older than your country. It didn't fall down, nobody tore it apart. It's just still standing, doing its job like it always has. That's normal to you. Buildings last, cities last, nations last, mostly, unless something dramatic happens, a war, an invasion, a bomb. But that's not actually how most civilizations end. 6 of the most advanced societies that ever existed on this planet didn't get fall to armies. They didn't get burned down in a single dramatic night. They just stopped working, slowly, quietly. And in almost every case, the thing that killed them wasn't a villain. It was something so ordinary that the people living through it probably didn't even notice it happening. A river moved a few miles. A rainy season came late for a few decades in a row. A hillside lost its trees. That's it. That's sometimes all it takes to end a civilization of hundreds of thousands of people. So let's go through 6 of them. Not the myths, the actual evidence. Because once you see the pattern, you start to notice it's the same story wearing different clothes, over and over again, on every continent, thousands of years apart. Around 2600 BCE, in what's now Pakistan and northwest India, a civilization existed that most people have never heard of, even though it was bigger than Egypt and Mesopotamia combined at its peak. Cities like Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa had grid-patterned streets, standardized brick sizes across a territory the size of a small country, and covered drainage systems running under nearly every house. A sewage system more advanced than what most European cities had 4,000 years later. An estimated 5 million people lived under this civilization at its height.
And then, starting around 1900 BCE, it began to unravel. Cities were gradually abandoned. Writing, which the Indus people used on thousands of seals, simply stopped appearing in the archaeological record and has never been deciphered to this day. For decades, historians assumed invasion, nomadic tribes sweeping in and destroying the cities. But there's a problem with that theory. Archaeologists have never found mass graves, burned layers, or weapons damage consistent with a war of conquest. What they have found is sediment. Geologists studying the region have traced the ancient path of a river system, including a now-vanished river some researchers associate with the Sarasvati mentioned in later texts, and found that around this same period, tectonic shifts and changing monsoon patterns caused several major rivers in the region to change course or dry up entirely. The monsoon itself weakened for centuries. Without predictable flooding to replenish farmland, the elaborate cities that depended on consistent agricultural surplus simply couldn't feed themselves anymore. People didn't get conquered. They walked away from cities that no longer had water, spreading out into smaller farming villages across the countryside. The civilization didn't end in fire. It ended in a slow drought that lasted longer than anyone's lifetime. Between 250 and 900 CE, the Maya built one of the most sophisticated civilizations in the Americas. Cities like Tikal and Calakmul, with populations in the tens of thousands, an accurate calendar system, and monumental stone architecture built without metal tools or the wheel for transport. Then, over roughly a century, city after city in the southern lowlands was abandoned. Construction of new monuments stopped. Populations that had numbered in the millions dropped by an estimated 90% in some regions. For a long time, this was blamed on warfare between city-states, and warfare certainly increased in the final decades. Inscriptions from this period reference conflicts between rival kingdoms with unusual frequency. But warfare alone doesn't explain why the cities weren't reoccupied afterward, or why the jungle simply swallowed them. The clearer answer came from lake sediment cores drilled in the Yucatan, which preserve a year-by-year record of rainfall going back thousands of years through the layers of gypsum and organic material that settle at the bottom. Those cores show that the exact period of Maya collapse overlaps with a series of severe, prolonged droughts, some of the driest multi-decade stretches in the region in over 1,000 years. The Maya had also spent centuries deforesting land for agriculture and to fuel the lime plaster used in their construction, which likely reduced regional rainfall even further and made soil erosion worse. So you have a civilization that had already pushed its environment close to its limit, then got hit with a drought cycle at the worst possible time. Farms failed, warfare over shrinking resources spiked, which the inscriptions confirm, and city by city, the system that had sustained kings and elaborate court life simply ran out of the surplus food required to support it.
In 985 CE, Eric the Red led Norse settlers to Greenland, and against incredible odds, they built a functioning European-style farming society at the edge of the Arctic Circle. Churches, livestock, trade routes back to Iceland and Norway, all sustained for close to 500 years. Then, sometime in the 15th century, the eastern settlement went silent. No records, no letters, nothing. When later expeditions visited the site, they found only ruins. The old explanation was simple. It got cold and they froze. And climate was absolutely part of it. This period overlaps with the beginning of the Little Ice Age, when average temperatures across the North Atlantic dropped enough to shorten growing seasons and increase sea ice, which choked off the shipping routes the settlers depended on for trade and supplies from Europe. But ice cores and archaeological digs at Norse farm sites tell a more layered story. The settlers had brought a European farming model, cattle, sheep, hayfields, into an environment that couldn't support it once the climate shifted. Isotope analysis of animal bones from these farms shows increasing reliance on marine food sources as land-based farming failed, suggesting a population under real dietary stress. Meanwhile, the settlers largely refused to adopt hunting and fishing techniques used by the neighboring Inuit, who thrived in the exact same conditions, using kayaks, harpoons, and a diet built around seals. The Norse stuck rigidly to their cattle and barley identity even as it stopped working, while a few hundred miles away, people using a different approach to the same land were doing fine. Cold didn't kill Norse Greenland by itself. Cultural inflexibility in the face of a changing climate did.
Somewhere around 1200 CE, Polynesian voyagers reached one of the most remote islands on Earth and built a civilization capable of carving and moving nearly 900 Moai statues, some over 30 feet tall and weighing up to 80 tons. By the time Europeans arrived in 1722, the population had crashed to a fraction of its peak, and the island was largely treeless grassland. The popular version of this story, ecological suicide, where the islanders cut down every palm tree on the island, competing to build bigger statues until the whole system collapsed, has been the standard narrative for decades. But more recent research complicates it significantly. Pollen records do confirm the island's palm forests vanished within a couple of centuries of human arrival, and Polynesian rats introduced by the settlers likely ate palm seeds faster than the trees could reproduce, accelerating the deforestation. That part checks out. What's more contested is the population collapse itself. Skeletal analysis from the island shows less evidence of the kind of starvation and violence you'd expect from a full societal implosion than the old theory predicted. And the most severe population crash actually lines up with European contact, the introduction of diseases the islanders had no immunity to, plus slave raids in the 1860s that removed a huge percentage of the remaining population. So the honest picture is probably two hidden forces stacked together. An ecological collapse driven by deforestation and an invasive species that reshaped the island over centuries, followed by a demographic collapse driven by contact with outsiders that had almost nothing to do with the trees at all. This one isn't a single civilization, it's roughly a dozen of them falling apart within the same 50-year window, around 1200 to 1150 BCE, across the entire eastern Mediterranean. The Mycenaean palaces of Greece, the Hittite Empire in Anatolia, and major cities along the Levantine coast were destroyed or abandoned almost simultaneously. Trade networks that had connected Egypt, Cyprus, the Aegean, and the Near East for centuries collapsed overnight, and writing itself disappeared from Greece for roughly 300 years afterward, a gap historians literally call the Greek Dark Ages. For a long time, this was pinned entirely on the Sea Peoples, a mysterious raiding confederation mentioned in Egyptian inscriptions as attacking from the sea. And they were real, and they clearly did real damage. But an entire network of interconnected superpowers doesn't collapse just because of raiders, unless something had already made the whole system fragile.
Climate data pulled from pollen cores and cave formations across the region point to a severe, extended drought hitting right around this same window. one of the worst in millennia. That drought would have triggered crop failures across an economic system that depended heavily on grain trade between kingdoms. Egypt, for instance, regularly shipped grain to allies during shortages. When everyone's crops failed at once, that safety net disappeared. Some historians now describe this less as one collapse and more as a cascading systems failure. Drought caused famine, famine caused migrations and desperate raiding groups, possibly including displaced peoples who became the Sea Peoples themselves. And the raids finished off palace economies that were already starving and couldn't fight back. Take away any one piece, the drought, the trade network's fragility, the raids, and the other Bronze Age superpowers, 6 or more interconnected kingdoms, might have survived. Together, they didn't stand a chance. At its height in the 12th century, the Khmer Empire's capital at Angkor was almost certainly the largest urban settlement on Earth, sprawling across nearly 400 square miles, larger than modern-day Los Angeles. Its most astonishing achievement wasn't Angkor Wat itself, though that's the part everyone recognizes. It was the water. The Khmer engineers built a vast network of reservoirs, canals, and moats to control monsoon flooding and store water through the dry season, supporting rice farming intensive enough to feed a population estimated at up to 1 million people. By the 15th century, Angkor was largely abandoned. Tree ring data from the region, cross-referenced with sediment analysis of the city's canals, reveals the trigger. Decades-long megadroughts in the 1300s and 1400s, interrupted by intense monsoon flooding events that the drought-damaged infrastructure could no longer handle. The very system that had made Angkor possible, total control over water, became a liability once the climate swung to extremes on both ends. Silt-clogged canals during the wet years, the reservoirs ran dry during the drought years. Excavations show the Khmer engineers tried to repair and rebuild parts of the system as it failed, patch jobs on infrastructure that had taken generations to build the first time. It wasn't enough. As the water system broke down, farmland failed, and the population that the enormous city depended on for food had nowhere to go but away.
Look at all 6 again, side by side. A drought that moved a river in Pakistan, a century of dry years in Central America, a cooling ocean around Greenland, a vanishing forest on a Pacific island, a drought that starved a dozen Bronze Age kingdoms at once, a broken water system in Cambodia. None of these civilizations were destroyed in a single battle. Every single one of them was built around a very specific, very narrow set of environmental conditions. A river that flows a certain way, a rainy season that arrives on schedule, a forest that keeps growing back, a temperature range that crops can survive in. And every single one of them eventually met a version of the natural world that no longer matched the one they were built for. The uncomfortable part is that none of these societies were stupid or primitive. The Khmer engineered water systems more advanced than anything nearby for centuries. The Maya tracked astronomical cycles with extraordinary precision. The people of the Indus Valley built sanitation systems that wouldn't be matched again in the region for millennia. Sophistication didn't save them, because the problem was never a lack of intelligence. The problem was dependency on an environment holding still long enough for that intelligence to keep working. You live inside systems today that are just as specific and just as fragile in their own way. A power grid tuned to a certain climate, farmland that depends on aquifers being refilled at a certain rate, cities built on coastlines assuming sea levels stay where they are. It's not that history is warning you about a specific flood or a specific drought. It's warning you about something quieter, that the conditions a civilization is built on are never guaranteed to last. And the moment we stop paying attention to that fact is usually the same moment we're already in trouble. 6 civilizations didn't see it coming quickly enough. The evidence is still sitting in the ice cores, in the lake sediment, and the tree rings, waiting for anyone willing to look.